Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. First of all, thank you very much for joining this series of webinars we have conducted. Because the most important period in dairy management is the transition period. And as a part of this, Arm & Hammer is going to have this webinar series having discussions in different part of transition cow management, and it is not only included with our decad management, rather it is going to cover with many aspects of transition cow, which is going to address different kind of challenges faced by the farmers. We have four series and four sessions for this webinar series. So I'll encourage everyone to register for all four sessions. The link is given in the original invitation which you have received. If you have not done, please do that. And to start with today's sessions, we have Dr. Ben Saylor with us. So just to introduce him, Dr. Ben Saylor is the Dairy Tech Support Manager for Arm & Hammer, and he is a graduate in animal science from University of Arizona, and then he did his master's in animal science from Kansas State University, and then he holds his PhD in Rumen and nutrition from Wisconsin Madison University. Dr. Saylor provides training and field support for our customers, and especially in the field of nutrition and cow management. He's very much passionate about helping dairy producers to understand and address on-farm challenges in order to improve their productivity. Dr. Ben lives in Arizona, Phoenix area with his family. And one more thing I would like to add, you may be having questions from during this discussion. So you can type them in the question and answer session, and at the end of the presentation, we'll try to answer all your queries. So Dr. Ben, now stage is yours. You can start your presentation. Thank you.
Ajit, thank you very much for the introduction. It is my pleasure to be kicking off this transition cow management series. So yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever in the world you might be. The topic of discussion today is going to be the importance of feed hygiene for a successful transition. As Ajit mentioned, I think when we think about transition cow management, we immediately think about balancing cations and anions. We might think about nutrient composition of the diet. We might think about days, how long that animal is in a close-up period, for example, how to manage that fresh animal. I don't think we often consider the importance that feed hygiene or feed cleanliness plays in creating a successful transition for our transition cows. So I'm very happy to be starting off this webinar series by talking about feed hygiene. And as Ajit mentioned, we will address questions at the end of the talk. So please add your questions into the question and answer chat box below. So I would like to begin with a quick outline of my presentation so that everyone knows the journey that we're about to embark on together. So I'll start off with a quick introduction to the transition period. And then I will describe what we at Arm & Hammer call the three pillars of a resilient cow, or in this case, a resilient transition cow. And then I will talk about the impact that poor feed hygiene has on cow resilience. And then we'll talk about how we can address these feed hygiene issues. And I've kind of broken this down into two options. We can respond to current feed hygiene challenges that we might be experiencing. And then we can obviously prevent future challenges from taking place. And then I'll wrap everything up with some conclusions, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So just a quick introduction to the transition period. As I'm sure we are all aware, the first several weeks of lactation represent one of the highest risk periods in the life of a dairy cow. There's numerous studies that have shown that all cows after calving experience some degree of systemic inflammation. And some work by Dr. Lance Baumgart at Iowa State University helped us discover that immune activation and disease has a very high energetic cost to a dairy cow, and can be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 kilograms of glucose per day. And so it's very important that we do everything we can to minimize this immune activation, to minimize inflammation in these animals, to try to spare some of that energy so that it can be used for more productive means. And so my argument this morning is that a successful transition requires that inflammation be controlled and that cows be ultimately resilient to whatever challenges they might face. And I believe that feed hygiene plays a very strong role in controlling inflammation and helping these animals be resilient. So as we talk about resilience, I want to introduce an idea that here at Arm & Hammer we call the 3 pillars of a resilient transition cow. And the idea here, and this would apply for peak lactation animals, late lactation animals, heifers, calves. So I want to talk about the 3 pillars really of a resilient cow. And I would say they would be the same, regardless of which production group we're talking about. And so the 3 pillars of resilient cow are: first, pathogen control; second, optimal rumen function. Obviously, if we're talking about a calf, these calves don't have a functioning rumen yet, but we would like to help create a rumen that is functioning optimally. And then the 3rd pillar of a resilient cow would be hindgut health. And it's our thinking that if we can help our herds, and in this case, if we can help our transition cows achieve each of these pillars successfully, if we can control pathogens in transition cows, if we can ensure that their rumen is functioning optimally, and if we can help make sure that these transition animals have a healthy hindgut, in a way we can actually create an animal that is more resilient to pressure, more resilient to challenge. And these resilient animals are the ones that are going to be consistently at a very high level of performance. And I think that is very central to the profitability of any dairy operation, is consistent performance. So unfortunately, poor feed hygiene can kind of mess up this system. And let me just quickly define feed hygiene, in case this is a term that some of you may not be familiar with. So when I talk about feed hygiene, I'm not talking about feed nutrient composition. I'm not talking about the physical components of feed. I'm talking more about microbial components of feed. And so feed hygiene is directly related to the presence or lack thereof of pathogens in the TMR, the total mixed ration, in our different feed ingredients, pathogens that could be detrimental to the health and performance of our dairy cows. And so when I'm talking about feed hygiene, I'm talking specifically about creating feed that is free of pathogens and other organisms that might be detrimental to animal health. And so I talked about how poor feed hygiene can kind of mess up our resilient cow, and I'll kind of now walk us through how that happens. So I first want to talk about how poor feed hygiene can make pathogen control a challenge. So as I just discussed in my definition of feed hygiene, poor feed hygiene really will expose transition animals to pathogens coming in through the feed. Feed that has been contaminated with different pathogens can be a very significant source of a very diverse group of organisms, specifically things like wild yeasts, molds, which we know can produce mycotoxins. Contaminated feed can also be a significant source of Clostridium. And I'll talk about two different types of Clostridium. The first would be toxin-producing Clostridium. When we talk about toxin-producing Clostridium, I think the one that most often comes to mind is Clostridium perfringens. When we have Clostridium in our feed, though, we don't just have toxin-producing Clostridium, we also have solvent-producing Clostridium. These organisms can produce different solvents in the rumen of a dairy cow, such as butanol, acetone, and our current thinking is that many of these end products of metabolism of these solvent-producing Clostridium can actually be detrimental to rumen function. Contaminated feed can also be a significant source of salmonella, as well as pathogenic E. coli, which we know can both impact animal health and performance in a negative way. So next, I want to talk about how poor feed hygiene can impact rumen function. So poor feed hygiene can cause suboptimal rumen function. I briefly mentioned this before, but elevated counts of solvent-producing Clostridium species, examples are Clostridium bifermentans and Clostridium berryinkii. We find these organisms to be very prevalent in both feed samples and fecal samples of dairy cows. But elevated counts of these solvent-producing Clostridium may be detrimental to ruminal fibrolytic bacteria communities. We have some research that has shown that if we're able to control some of these solvent-producing Clostridium species within that rumen system, we actually see increased populations of some very important fiber-digesting bacteria. We also know that high yeast counts in the total mixed ration have been shown to reduce dry matter intake. There's a study by Windle and Kung that shows that high yeast counts reduce intake. And then there's a study by Santos and others that showed that high yeast counts in the ration can be detrimental to in vitro fiber digestibility. And here's a figure from that Santos and others study that I just referenced. And so this figure is kind of showing the effect that yeast has on in vitro neutral detergent fiber digestibility within that TMR. And so in this experiment, essentially, they had a highly contaminated source of high moisture grain. This high moisture grain had very high levels of yeast. And so then they controlled the yeast challenge by adding different amounts of this contaminated high moisture corn into their total mixed ration. And this was an in vitro experiment. This was not done in live animals. But what you can see is compared to the control, which is this left-hand bar, increasing that yeast challenge. So going from a low yeast challenge to a moderate yeast challenge to a high yeast challenge had a negative effect on the 24-hour in vitro fiber digestibility of that TMR. And so we know that the presence of high levels of wild yeasts can be detrimental to fiber digestibility. And we know that in our transition animals, it's crucial that they have a sufficient ability to digest fiber. So in addition to yeast having a negative effect on intake and fiber digestibility, there's also some work that has shown that high mold counts in the total mixed ration have been linked to reduced milk yield. And here's that study. This is an older study published by Hoffman and Acker. And essentially it shows a strong negative correlation between mold counts on the x-axis in the TMR and milk yield here on the y-axis. So the last component of this I would like to talk about is how poor feed hygiene can be detrimental to the health of the hindgut of our transition cows. So the intestinal epithelium, or the hindgut lining, serves a dual purpose, and I think it's very important that we remember what this intestinal epithelium is there for. And so it has a dual purpose. Its primary purpose is nutrient absorption, as we all would know. But the other purpose of that intestinal epithelium is to protect that animal from mycotoxins and pathogens that might be present in the gastrointestinal tract. We know that mycotoxins that are not detoxified in the rumen, if they are absorbed, if they attach to that hindgut epithelium and they're absorbed and go systemic, that these mycotoxins can cause a host of different health challenges as well as reproductive challenges. We also know that pathogens, live organisms in the gastrointestinal tract, can cause a host of health issues. Examples of organisms that would cause health issues would be salmonella and pathogenic E. coli. A very common example, at least in my part of the world, is Clostridium perfringens, leading to what we call hemorrhagic bowel syndrome in dairy animals. So I want to just share a nice figure. This is a figure by Goossens and others, and it kind of shows the trajectory of Clostridium perfringens induced hemorrhagic bowel syndrome, or HBS, in a dairy cow. So in this first panel, this is kind of when everything is going okay. The Clostridium perfringens are represented by these orange rectangles. The multicolored shapes over here represent kind of the healthy, normal gut microbiota. And it's important to recognize that Clostridium perfringens, although it is a organism that produces toxins and can be detrimental to the health of a transition cow, it is present in a healthy animal. The problem, however, is when populations of Clostridium perfringens start to outcompete the more healthy gut microorganisms. And so what happens is, if populations of these Clostridium perfringens increase to the point that they're actually competing with this healthy microbiome, Clostridium perfringens begins by producing different enzymes that work to degrade. This is the mucus layer that helps to protect the epithelial lining of the small intestine. And so if we move on to panel 2, if that mucus layer has been broken down, now that mucus layer is no longer providing protection for that epithelial layer. And now Clostridium perfringens is alive and well, and it can begin releasing toxins. One of the most common toxins that we know Clostridium perfringens produces is alpha toxin. And without this protective lining, these toxins will bind to the intestinal epithelium and actually stimulate an immune response. If we move on to panel 3, this is, we're getting progressively worse here. With that heightened immune response and inflammation, we actually see what this leads to is sloughing of the intestinal lining. So what we see is, some of these intestinal epithelial cells are being released from the lining of the small intestine. So at this point, we're losing gut integrity. And if we move on to panel 4, this is kind of the worst case scenario. Now, without a functional gut lining, pathogens and toxins and other detrimental compounds in that gastrointestinal tract can actually now reach the bloodstream enters systemic circulation. You can actually see that this immune response has caused the vascular tissue to actually hemorrhage, and so now we have hemorrhaging, and ultimately in panel 4, this is what would lead to clinical hemorrhagic bowel syndrome and ultimately cow death. And so just to touch on a couple more principles. So when these toxins and pathogens breach the intestinal barrier, as we saw in the previous image, a number of different immune cells and immune tissues react. And it's important to remember that the lamina propria, which sits just beyond this intestinal lining, in this image, the lumen, or the inside of the small intestine, is here at the top. And then we have our intestinal epithelium here. The lamina propria sits just beyond that epithelial layer. That lamina propria is home to an estimated 70 to 80% of the immune system. A vast majority of the animal's immune system is actually located in the gut. And so when these pathogens and toxins are able to breach the intestinal epithelium, if we do not have a functioning gut barrier, because a majority of the immune system is present just beyond that gut lining, that immune response can be very heightened. It can happen very quickly, and that can ultimately lead to systemic inflammation. And as I discussed in the very first slide, there is an energetic cost to inflammation. And so we want to do everything we can to prevent pathogens and toxins from entering circulation and causing systemic inflammation. So now that I think, have had a thorough discussion on the challenge that poor feed hygiene can have on animal health and resilience, let's talk about more positive things. So I want to begin by talking about how we can address feed hygiene issues. So in my mind, we really have two options. First, we can respond to current challenges that we might be aware of. And the second option is to prevent future challenges from ever happening to begin with. So how can we respond to current feed hygiene issues? My first recommendation would be to take advantage of prebiotic feed additives. At Arm & Hammer, we have two very high quality prebiotics, specifically Amax, which is a high quality yeast culture, and then Celminex, which combines the yeast culture technology with refined functional carbohydrates that have been enzymatically hydrolyzed from the yeast cell wall for improved functionality and bioavailability for animals. I would start here. These two products are going to help create a healthy gut for our transition animals in order to address whatever feed hygiene issues might be present on the farm. So let me talk a little bit about how these products can do that. So Amax and Celminex have both been shown to improve rumen function. So in multiple in vitro and in vivo studies, Amax and Celminex have been shown to improve a number of different parameters related to rumen function, specifically production of all the fatty acids, dry matter digestibility, neutral detergent fiber digestibility, crude protein digestibility, and feed efficiency. And like we discussed before, having a functioning rumen is essential for having a resilient transition cow that can withstand the pressures that she might be under. Celminex in particular also helps to control pathogens that might be present in the hindgut. We've talked pretty extensively about the risk that different pathogens can have to transition cows. And so here's some data. On the y-axis, we have the number of cells of these different pathogen types capable of infecting. And so the higher the number, the greater the risk these pathogens are posing. The lower the number, the lower the risk. And what we see is that in vitro, Celminex has the ability to bind these different pathogens and actually prevent them from causing an infection. And we see that compared to the control, Salmonex helps reduce the risk of Salmonella Newport, Salmonella Dublin, as well as E. coli. And so it's very important to utilize products like this to help control pathogens like Salmonella and E. coli that might be present in the hindgut of our transition cows. So in addition to controlling pathogens, Salmonex also has the ability to effectively bind mycotoxins. And as we discussed, mycotoxins that are not detoxified in the rumen will enter the hindgut, and if they are absorbed, can cause a number of health issues, reproduction issues, and ultimately can be detrimental to performance. And so if we look at the figure on the left, this figure is looking at the effect of these different types of mycotoxins on the health of epithelial cells, either in the presence of Salmonex or in the presence of nothing. So on the y-axis, this is the cytotoxicity score, which is a measurement of cell damage. So a high cytotoxicity score would be representative of a very damaged cell. A low score would be a relatively healthy cell. And what we see is that even in the presence of these multiple mycotoxins, Salmonex is able to dramatically reduce the cytotoxicity score or the damage that's being incurred by these different mycotoxins on epithelial cells. And so Salmonex, by binding these toxins, can ultimately prevent damage of epithelial cells in the small intestine. The figure on the right is actually a comparison of Salmonex with some other common yeast type products available to dairy producers. And on the y-axis, we have the percentage of undamaged cells. On the x-axis, we have these different yeast type products. And what we see is that compared with all of our competition, Salmonex has a much greater ability to protect epithelial cells from aflatoxin, fumonisin, and T2 toxin. And so again, very important to utilize technologies like Salmonex to control pathogens in the hindgut, as well as bind mycotoxins that might be coming from a feed hygiene issue. So we talked about how to address current challenges. I want to talk now about how we might be able to prevent future feed hygiene issues from ever happening. So I think my first recommendation would be to treat all of our silages, all of our fermented forages with a research-proven microbial inoculant. I'm sure inoculants are familiar to all of you here, but in case they're not, just a quick overview. Silage inoculants supply scientifically selected bacteria to our forage prior to fermentation so that we can influence that fermentation for the better. By applying these scientifically selected bacteria into our silage pile or bunker, we can ultimately help create a more efficient and more dependable fermentation by influencing that microbial community. So in addition to treating silages with microbial inoculants to help prevent the growth of the different pathogens we've been talking about, I would also recommend that we implement simple management strategies to prevent contamination of clean feed. And I'll walk us through 8 different strategies that we can take on farm today. But I want to begin by talking about two different microbial inoculants that we have here at Arm & Hammer that can help prevent the growth of some of these pathogens that we've been talking about. So the first inoculant I want to mention is Certilis buchneri. This product, Certilis buchneri, contains a unique strain of Lactobacillus buchneri, which is a very popular organism to be included in silage inoculants, but we have access to a unique strain of this bacteria for improved yeast control and spoilage prevention as we're feeding out that silage. So I have two pieces of data here to share with you. Figure 2 is looking at the aerobic stability or the shelf life of corn silage, either untreated control or treated with Certillus buchneri. So we know that when silage is exposed to air, different spoilage organisms begin to grow and can cause heating. And when we see that heating, essentially what we're observing is spoilage. And so one way to measure the stability or the shelf life of our silage is we can actually measure the amount of time it takes for the silage that has been exposed to air to undergo a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. And so what we see from this first figure is that the corn silage treated with Certillus buchneri had a stability that was 26 hours longer than the untreated corn silage. And how was it doing this? If we look onto figure 3, we see that this is happening because the Certillus buchneri is helping to control the outgrowth of yeasts in the corn silage. So on the y-axis, we have yeast counts, so we can measure growth of these yeast populations. And on the x-axis, we have hours in aerobic conditions. So this would kind of be a simulated feed-out phase. Once we've opened the silage pile, this is a simulated feed-out phase. And what we can see is that at time 0, this would be the moment we open that silage pile, we see that Certillus buchneri treated corn silage had lower counts of yeast than the untreated corn silage, which means Certillus buchneri was able to help control growth of these yeasts during storage. But even more important than that, we see that Certillus buchneri is able to help control the outgrowth of these yeast populations. So we see that it takes much longer for yeast populations to grow when that corn silage is treated with Certillus buchneri. And so again, not only are we going to have improved nutrient retention, less spoilage, less heating because of the Certillus buchneri treatment, but we're also going to have lower yeast cells present in that silage, which, as we discussed in an earlier slide, that yeast can be detrimental to animal performance. The second inoculant I want to talk about today is another product of ours at Arm & Hammer called Certillus Prime. And Certillus Prime contains a unique strain of bacillus to help control Clostridium during fermentation and feed out. We talked at length about kind of the risk that both toxin producing and solvent producing Clostridium can have on animal health. And so at Arm & Hammer, we have an inoculant to help control Clostridial species in the silage. And so the figure on the left, this is a survey of silage samples, alfalfa haylage samples around the upper Midwest of the United States. And the red dots represent silages that were treated with our product, Certillus Prime. The blue dots represent silages that were not treated with Certillus Prime. And what we see is that Certillus Prime was able to help control Clostridial counts in these silages. So we see lower counts of Clostridium in the haylages treated with Certillus Prime. If we move on to figure 3, this was pretty exciting work as well. So again, very similar to the previous slide, we have Clostridial counts on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we have hours in aerobic conditions, again, simulating another feed-out phase. And so what we see is that Certillus Prime was able to control Clostridial outgrowth throughout fermentation, because at time 0, we have lower counts of Clostridia in that haylage treated with Certillus Prime. And what was really great is similar to the previous slide, Certilis prime was able to control the outgrowth of Clostridium during the feed out phase. So we know that Clostridial organisms can grow and proliferate during feed out. And so, and you can see this in this experiment here, where the untreated halage, we see a pretty dramatic increase in Clostridial counts between 0 and 7 hours in aerobic conditions. But Certilis prime was able to help control that Clostridial outgrowth. Okay, so in addition to treating our silages with high quality microbial inoculants to help prevent the growth of different pathogens, I want to provide 8 strategies for improving feed hygiene that really can be implemented on the farm today. Just something I want to point out. So we're putting so much effort into formulating rations and harvesting our forages at the correct maturity, storing them properly, acquiring the best ingredients possible. We can put together the best diet possible, but if we're contaminating that clean total mixed ration with pathogens because of minor mistakes that are being made on the farm, despite how nice that diet is, we could be challenging our transition animals with different types of pathogens. And so hopefully the strategies I provide will be very beneficial, whether you are a dairy producer or work with dairy producers. Hopefully some of these strategies can be implemented to help improve feed hygiene on the dairy. So the first strategy would be to steam clean the total mixed ration mixer or the mixer wagon. I don't think this happens very often, but I think it's certainly something that can happen on a pretty routine basis. So ideally, these farms should be bringing in their mixer wagon at least once a month for routine maintenance to make sure the knives are sharp, to make sure everything is mixing well. I would recommend that at this time of maintenance, that somebody go in and clean, ideally with hot steam, clean the inside of that mixer wagon, because as you can see in this figure here on the left, in different corners of that mixer wagon, we can get over time, feed can build up. In these locations, we can have the growth of mold, E. coli, salmonella, other pathogens. And every time we add clean feed into this mixer wagon, it could potentially be contaminated by some of this residual material. And so the first strategy I would recommend would be to clean the mixer wagon on a routine basis. The second strategy would be to steam clean whatever we're using to push up our feed on the dairy. Whether this is a blade, whether this is a robot, whether it's a tire of some kind, I would recommend cleaning that push-up device routinely. I would recommend doing that monthly. As you can see here on the right, here's an example of a push-up blade that has some residual rotten feed on top of it. So again, we lay down fresh, clean feed in front of our transition cows. Every time we go to push up this feed, we can potentially be inoculating that clean feed with contaminated feed. I also want to mention, if we can use shorter push-up blades, ideally around 4 feet, can help prevent the feed that we're pushing up from being contaminated with dirt or manure. So the longer blade we have, we can accidentally push dirt and manure that might be present in the feed lanes into that fresh total mixed ration. So I would recommend using a shorter push-up blade if possible to prevent that kind of contamination. Strategy 3 would be to clean the tires and buckets of feed payloaders, skid loaders, any other machinery that we're using to actually handle and mix feed. And just to remind everyone, so many of these pathogens, whether we're talking about Salmonella, E. coli, Clostridium, many of these pathogens are found in fecal material and are found in the dirt. And so if we can prevent dirt and fecal contamination of our clean feed, that's a very important component of optimizing feed hygiene. So I would recommend that we avoid using buckets that have moved manure or dirt to handle feed. Again, we have a very high risk of cross-contamination. I would also recommend that the buckets that have been contaminated with dirt or manure be steam cleaned on a routine basis. We see it's very easy for moldy, rotten feed to get trapped in the corners of these buckets. This is something we want to be cleaning out on a routine, on a routine basis. Strategy number 4, this is a kind of a multi-part strategy, so it'll actually carry on to the next slide as well. But strategy number 4 is to ensure that our silage pads, our feed areas are free from debris and spoiled feed. You can see in this photo here, not only do we have some leachate from our silage pile contaminating this silage pad, we also have some old, spoiled, loose silage that is, as well as some dirt on this pad. All of these sources can be a potential contaminant of our clean, high quality silage that we're putting up. So it's very important that we scrape these areas to prevent contamination as much as possible. I would also recommend that we avoid tracking manure or mud into these areas. Again, manure and dirt are primary sources of some of these pathogens we've been talking about. If we're feeding high moisture byproducts on the dairy, we know these products are very prone to spoilage. So I would recommend that we feed these byproducts in a very timely fashion, feed them up as quickly as possible. And then we want to make sure that the commodity bay or the area that we're storing these byproducts are fully emptied before restocking. We don't want to be putting clean, fresh byproduct on top of old byproduct that could have potentially spoiled. Again, that could be causing some contamination. So continuing on with this same strategy, we want to make sure that if we have spoiled silage, if we have some silage that's not treated with inoculants and it is spoiling, this material should be moved off that silage pad as soon as possible. We also want to make sure that we optimize our silage feed out rate. So how much of that silage we're feeding out every single day. We want to increase that as much as possible. We also want to feed any silage that has been defaced, taken off the face of that pile. We want to feed that immediately, because again, the longer this silage is exposed to oxygen, the more spoilage can occur. Moving on to strategy number 5, I would recommend that we ensure that the feed alley, so the area kind of along which we lay our total mixed ration, is free from debris. These feed alleys, so this piece right here in the middle, should be scraped once daily or more if needed. We also want to avoid tracking mud and manure into these areas. We can see that in both of these photos, we have feed alleys that are contaminated with dirt, old feed, and if we're not scraping these areas daily, we have a much higher risk of contamination. Strategy number 6 would be to clean out our feed bunks, especially directly under the headlocks if we have headlocks. So I would recommend that we remove any buildup under the headlocks at least once or twice a week. You can see in these 2 pictures, we have 2 different headlocks on 2 different dairies. We can see buildup of old moldy feed underneath these headlocks. This old moldy feed can be a very substantial source of Salmonella, E. coli, yeasts, molds. And again, if we're not taking care of this feed area and removing this built up feed, every time we lay down freshly mixed dry cow or fresh cow feed, we could potentially be contaminating that fresh feed with this spoiled material. I would also recommend, if possible, that the feed bunks be steam cleaned to kill any residual pathogens at least 2 to 3 times a year. I would also make sure that we really try to avoid driving over feed in the feed bunks. One of our collaborators here in the US did a project where they looked at counts of Clostridium in the TMR before or after a clean tractor tire drove over the TMR. And they actually found significantly higher counts of Clostridium in the TMR where that clean tractor tire had driven over the feed. And so every time we drive over that feed, especially if we're doing it with dirty tires, we're kind of reintroducing pathogens into that TMR. All right, the last 2 strategies I have for you. Strategy number 7 is to make sure waterers are clean and clear. If we're putting a lot of effort into making sure all of our feed is clean and hygienic and free from pathogens, but we're neglecting the waterers, that could be a hidden source of contamination and challenge to our cows. So a good rule of thumb would be, if you wouldn't drink out of the waterers yourself, your cows shouldn't either. And so I really hope that the feed bunks on the dairies that we're working with, or sorry, the waterers on the dairies we're working with don't look like this one here. The last strategy I would have for you today is that we manage refusal feeding very carefully. Here in the US, it's a very common practice to feed refused feed to lower production group animals, such as dry cows, heifers, late lactation animals. We might feed feed that's been refused from our peak lactation groups. It's a very economical strategy. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but we want to do it carefully. So if feeding refusals is a common practice, I would recommend that you feed refusals as soon as possible, because that refusal, again, will have had more time exposed to oxygen, exposed to the elements, and could have greater pathogen growth. So we want to feed those refusals as soon as possible. We also want to avoid collecting refusals between feedings. If we're using the same tractor to collect refusals that we are to mix fresh feed, every time we go collect contaminated refusals, we could be contaminating our clean feed as well. And the last component of this strategy would be to mix any feed batches that contain refusals, to mix those last, to make sure that, each load that we are mixing is not being contaminated with pathogens that might be present in that refused material. So it has been an absolute pleasure to be able to share some of this information with you today. I'm very happy to kick off this Transition Cow series. So I want to wrap things up with just a few conclusions to summarize what we've talked about today. So the first point I want to remind everyone of is that controlling inflammation and improving our transition cows' resilience to challenges is critical for a successful transition to lactation. Second, a resilient cow requires kind of those 3 pillars: pathogen control, optimal rumen function, and a healthy hindgut. We discussed at length how poor feed hygiene can be a challenge to resilience, specifically by being a negative influence to these different pillars of a resilient animal. I would recommend that we respond to any current feed hygiene issues we have, whether it's Salmonella, E. coli, Clostridium, responding to those current feed hygiene issues with prebiotic feed additives like Amax or Salmonex from Arm & Hammer. And then lastly, I would encourage you all to prevent future feed hygiene issues by using research-proven silage inoculants, such as Certilis inoculants, as well as by implementing the management strategies I outlined to prevent contamination of your feed. I thank you all for your attention, and I am looking forward to answering some of your questions.
Dr. Ben, thank you very much. for a very nice, informative presentation. We have got many questions, but uh, we have like almost 10 minutes to get you to answer a few of them. So we will try to cover the questions we have during this time. So I will read one by one, and Dr. Ben, in the time limit, we'll try to please try to give the answers. So the first questions, I think it's coming from the inoculant side, which you were talking about, and this question is, shall we have to use both the inoculant you were talking about, like in the silage,
Yeah,
or one is sufficient?
that's a very good question. I mean, someone can certainly use both technologies, both the Buchnerite technology and the Prime technology. We actually have an inoculant that contains both the Lactobacillus buchneri and the bacillus in it. In the scenario where we know our given system is challenged with both high levels of yeasts, which would cause spoilage, and high levels of Clostridium. But really, to answer the question, I would say I would identify what is the primary challenge on the farm. Are we dealing with high wild yeast populations that are causing heating and spoilage of our silages? If that's the case, I would recommend Certillus buchneri to control that spoilage. Conversely, are we putting up legume silages or halages or grass silage, and do we have opportunity for dirt contamination during harvest, and is the primary challenge going to be Clostridium in that scenario? If it is, I would recommend the Prime technology. So my overall recommendation would be to try to identify the primary challenge that you're facing, and then use an inoculant that is going to help address that challenge.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. This is another question regarding the inoculants and the bacteria. The question is like, does this product Certillus have a postbiotic effect also?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Ajit, if he's referring to the inoculant product, as we also have a direct fed product as well. But so I don't have any data showing that our Certillus inoculants have a postbiotic effect. But I can refer to a few meta-analyses that were published in the last few years looking at the influence of inoculated silages on performance. And what I can say is that both of these meta-analyses published in the Journal of Dairy Science showed that inoculated silages improved animal performance. And by looking at the fermentation profile, by looking at counts of different microorganisms, the improvement in performance could not simply be explained by a better fermentation or by inhibiting yeasts and molds, for example. There was this meta-analysis determined there was some performance advantage of inoculated silage. And one of the hypotheses they threw out, and it hasn't been confirmed to my knowledge, one of the hypotheses they threw out is potentially the scientifically selected bacteria we're treating our silages with through the inoculant might be having some kind of effect on the microbiome of that animal. So I think there's potential for that, but I don't have any concrete data to show yet that is the case.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ben. The other question is coming about feeding, like sign and symptoms which are visible if a cow is fed with poor quality feed or silage. Generally, what you will see.
I'm scrolling through the questions, Ajit, just to make sure I understand. Okay, signs and symptoms visible if a cow is fed poor quality feed and silage. Is that the one you're referring to? Okay. Yeah, that's a very good question. So some common symptoms of, a feed hygiene related issue. Obviously, the one we're most attached to is performance. So if we're seeing, if we're doing all of our work to put together an optimal diet, if cows are comfortable, if cows are generally free from disease, but we feel like performance is just struggling, it's not quite where we want it to be, that might be indicative of a feed hygiene issue. Additionally, if we're seeing off-feed events, so very inconsistent intakes from one day to the next, if we're seeing inconsistent manure consistency, so if you walk through a pen and you see some cows have very loose manure, some have very firm manure, that could be indicative of a poor quality silage or feed. And then obviously, if we're talking about acute disease, hemorrhagic bowel syndrome or similar afflictions would be indicative of a Clostridium perfringens challenge.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. The other question is coming. Can you please more elaborate of the effect of AMAX, which we have like a yeast culture product, on feed hygiene?
So AMAX in particular is not going to make feed hygiene better or worse. But what AMAX is going to do, specifically in the rumen, is it's going to better condition that rumen to handle fluctuations in fiber digestibility, fluctuations in feed quality, and creating a rumen that supports optimal digestion of all of our feed ingredients is ultimately going to create a healthier animal that can better withstand feed hygiene issues. Salmonax, on the other hand, which is essentially our AMAX technology with the refined functional carbohydrates from yeast cell wall on top of that, that product, again, is not going to directly influence feed hygiene. But if we have a hygiene issue and we have salmonella and E. coli present in our feed, that product is going to help bind pathogens and mycotoxins in that hind gut and ultimately prevent damage to that intestinal epithelium.
Very nice, Dr. Ben. Thank you. We have a lot of questions we are trying to cover in our timeline. There is one question coming about the silage, and the question is like, if we have volatile fatty acids like propionic acid in corn silage, so what does this indicate? It's a bacterial growth or what?
Yeah. So in corn silage, propionic acid should be relatively low. It should be less than 1%. Of the dry matter. The primary volatile fatty acid should be lactic acid with minor amounts of acetic acid as well. So if we're seeing propionic acid, that can be indicative of a few different things. Some Clostridium can produce propionic acid, so that could be a source. Clostridial outgrowth could be the source of propionic acid. Additionally, we can't forget that although we're applying inoculants to our silages, hopefully, there's a native bacterial population present on these crops at harvest that has a very strong influence over our final fermentation. That's why we want to use inoculants, because the scientifically selected bacteria that we apply help dominate over that much more variable native population that can cause, inconsistent and inefficient fermentations. And so another thing to think about, if we're seeing high propionic acid, is potentially that native microbial population could be influencing that fermentation. There could be an organism in there that is producing propionic acid. And if that's the case, I would highly recommend using a microbial inoculant to help control the activity of that native bacterial population.
Thank you. The questions are keep coming, so we'll try to address two more questions because of the time limits. The second last question, Dr. Ban, is coming which yeast, live or dead, is having more uh, toxin binding ability?
Let me, okay, yep, I see that. I see that question. That's a good question. And I don't, to be honest, I don't really have a great answer, and I don't want to throw something out there that might be incorrect. My only, if we talk about toxin binding, what that's really coming from is those refined functional carbohydrates, the mannanoligosaccharides, the glucans in that yeast cell wall. And so obviously, whether we're talking about dead yeast, yeast culture, those refined functional carbohydrates will be present there. Obviously, some of those components are also present in live yeast. I don't have a great answer, but one thing I would say, the risk with live yeast is those organisms have to stay alive. And oftentimes how feed is handled, how feed is stored prior to feeding can be detrimental to the viability of those live yeast. And we might often see a lower amount of live yeast present in our feed than what would start in the product. And so that's just a comment I would make about some of the variability associated with live yeast. Other than that, in terms of mycotoxin binding ability, I don't really have a great answer for you, and I'm sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ban, for this honest answer. So one more question we will try to accommodate, though we have many more questions. But what we'll do, we'll try to send the answers by email later on after this meeting.
Yes.
So this is regarding the enzymes in the ruminant feed. So what do you think? Should we use enzymes in the ruminant feed, or use of Amax, Salmonex sort of thing is sufficient?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think to date, there's more research with yeast culture products like Amax and Salmonex than there is enzymes. I think there's potential for enzymes, but I think at this point, many enzymes are expensive, and there isn't as much peer-reviewed research showing that these enzymes have a dramatic effect on rumen function and fermentation than maybe we have for yeast culture. So at this point, I would, if you're going to spend some money, I would recommend spending it on a yeast culture product like Amax or Salmonex. But maybe somewhere down the line, we'll get more research regarding efficacy of enzymes. Maybe the cost will come down, in which case I would recommend both technologies to really help support our transition cows.
Nice. Thank you very much, Dr. Ben. And here we come to the end of this this webinar series for this session. And we have two more requests regarding the sharing of the presentation. It's quite interesting because I have got a lot of requests for sharing of the presentation, Dr. Ben. So for everyone, yes, we are going to share this presentation because we have got all the contacts, and to who has joined this presentation, definitely he will get the copy of it. Another question was coming, like, do we get the certificate of attending this webinar series? So yes, we have the plan. So the one who is going to attend all 4 sessions of this webinar, after that he's going to get a certificate signed by all the speakers. So with this, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Ben Saylor for having such a wonderful session. And most importantly, all the attendees who joined and take out time from their schedule to be with us in their afternoon and evening. I hope you have enjoyed, and again, I would request that keep registering for the rest of the 3 sessions, and I hope it's going to help a lot in your dairy farming as well as with your customers too. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next session. Thank you, Dr. Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.